You want to buy scrap metal? Dale Coburn set his coffee down on the counter and looked at the invoice like it had personally offended him. My plant threw that steel over your property line because the city wouldn't take it. You're telling me that's worth $47,000? The young man on the other side of the counter didn't move. Marcus Webb was 23 years old, and he had been waiting 4 years for this exact moment. He slid a second page across the counter without looking up. That's the low estimate, he said, and you still owe me for the trespassing. Dale laughed. He shouldn't have. To understand why that invoice existed, you have to go back to the summer Marcus was 9 years old. You have to go back to a narrow strip of land in Sudbury, Ontario, and a chain-link fence that divided two very different ideas about what something was worth. The land had belonged to Marcus's grandfather, Joseph Webb, since 1987. Joseph had bought it for $4,200 from a retired electrician who needed to settle a debt before winter. 400 meters of rocky Canadian shield running along the western edge of what would become. 6 years later, the back lot of Norwood Fabrication Limited, a mid-sized steel processing plant that cut structural beams and angle iron for construction companies across northern Ontario. The two properties shared a fence. The Webb side was narrow, scrubby, the kind of land nobody had ever known what to do with. Joseph had put a small house at the front and left the rest to wild grass and rock outcrop. He called it the long piece. His wife, Evelyn, called it the useless piece. His grandson, Marcus, called it, for most of his childhood, home. Marcus's mother, Diane Webb, had raised him in that house alone since he was 6. His father had moved to Calgary when the relationship ended, not badly, just finally, the way some things end when two people run out of reasons to stay in the same city. Diane worked the day shift at the regional hospital as an orderly. She left before Marcus woke up on school days and was usually home by the time he got off the bus, tired in the specific way that hospital floors make you tired, which is not just in the legs but somewhere deeper. Joseph Webb had died the spring Marcus turned 8. He left the land to Diane in a will written on a legal pad that the probate lawyer accepted without ceremony. He left Marcus a small red toolbox, a Montgomery Ward brand from the 70s, still solid, with a tray that slid out on 2 rails and a clasp that had never rusted. Inside were pliers, a crescent wrench, 2 screwdrivers, and a note in Joseph's handwriting that said, "A tool used is worth 10 tools stored." Marcus kept the toolbox under his bed for a year before he opened it. The fence between the Webb property and Norwood Fabrication was 4 feet of chain link, and in the summer Marcus was 9. He had nothing better to do than stand at it. Diane worked days. There was no money for camps. The nearest community center was a 20-minute bus ride that required a bus pass they renewed monthly when the money was there and didn't when it wasn't. So Marcus spent July at the fence, watching the plant's back lot the way a kid with nowhere to be watches anything that moves. What moved on Thursday afternoons was a forklift. Norwood's production process had a byproduct. When the plant cut structural steel to customer specification, the remainders, pieces 6 inches to 3 feet, dropped into a collection bin at the base of each saw station. Too short to resell as structural material. Too varied to bundle economically. The plant's waste disposal contract called for an industrial hauler to collect the steel trim twice a week and take it to a recycling depot 40 minutes south. What the contract didn't account for was the depot's weight minimums. Loads under a threshold weren't accepted on Thursdays. On those weeks, the forklift driver, a man named Terrence Okafor, who had worked the back lot for 11 years, was instructed to stage the overflow bin along the western fence and wait for the next Tuesday pickup. The overflow bin sat 8 feet from the chain link. One Thursday in July, Marcus watched Terrence set the bin down, hop off the forklift, and light a cigarette. He looked at the bin. Then he looked at Marcus. "You staring at something, son?" Marcus pointed at the bin. "What is that stuff?" Terrence looked at the bin the way a man looks at something he has stopped seeing because he sees it every week. "Steel offcuts. Off the saws. What happens to it?" "Recycler takes it Tuesday. What do they do with it?" Terrence took a drag. "Melt it down. Make new steel." Marcus thought about that for a moment. "Can I have some?" Terrence looked at the bin, then at the kid, then at the property behind the fence, which was clearly not the plant's property. He had 3 kids of his own. He was not a man who thought about liability in moments like this. What would you do with it? Marcus didn't have an answer. He just didn't want to watch it get melted. Terrence thought for exactly as long as it took to finish the cigarette. Then he reached into the bin, pulled out a flat length of angle iron about 18 inches long, and set it on the ground near the fence. "Don't tell anyone I did that," he said, and climbed back on the forklift. Marcus carried it home in both hands. It was heavier than he expected. He set it on the back step and looked at it until dinner. He came back the next Thursday. Terrence was there. He didn't say anything, but he set the overflow bin a little closer to the fence before he went back inside. Marcus spent an hour moving pieces through the chain link gap near the post, the one that had lifted from the ground after a hard frost the previous winter and never been fixed. That became the arrangement. No paperwork, no conversation after that first one. Just a forklift driver who stopped caring where the overflow bin was positioned, and a 9-year-old who came every Thursday with his grandfather's crescent wrench hooked to his belt like he had somewhere important to be. By the time Marcus was 10, he had a pile. By the time he was 12, it was a problem. Diane came out one Saturday morning to find a stack of steel scraps running along the back of the property taller than her head in 3 places. She stood in the wet grass in her slippers and looked at it for a long time. Then she came back inside and asked Marcus to explain himself. "It's steel," he said. "I can see it's steel." "Why is it in my backyard? It's good steel. They were just going to recycle it." Diane looked at him. He was 12 with his grandfather's same still expression, the one that made you feel like you were interrupting something. "Baby, the neighbors are going to think we're running a scrap yard. It's not scrap. Then what is it?" He didn't have an answer. Not yet. What he was doing, though he didn't have the word for it until later, was accumulating. He was also sorting. On the north side of the pile, flat bar and angle iron. On the south, plate steel in varying thicknesses. In the middle, tubing, square and round. He measured each piece with a tape measure he found at a garage sale for $1 and wrote the dimensions on the metal in white chalk marker, which he had seen someone use on a YouTube video and which he had asked Diane to buy him for his birthday. She had bought him a 4-pack and said nothing about it. He was watching videos. This was 2013, 2014, 2015, and the world of fabrication was finding its way onto the internet in ways it hadn't been before. Welders in garages, machinists in sheds, a man in rural Alberta who made furniture out of salvaged iron pipe and reclaimed barn board and documented every step with a camera balanced on a paint can. Marcus watched everything. He watched until the phone got hot and his eyes went dry, and Diane knocked on his door to tell him it was midnight and school was tomorrow. He learned what he had. Mild steel, mostly. Consistent carbon content, good for welding. He learned what welding was by watching it, then by researching the equipment, then by calculating how long it would take to save enough from shoveling driveways in winter to buy a used wire feed welder at an auction. It took 2 winters. He was 14. The welder cost him $65 at an estate sale in Chelmsford. The previous owner had been a hobbyist. The machine was old but clean, a Lincoln Electric 135, and it ran on standard 120-volt household current, which mattered because the Webb house had a detached shed at the back of the property with a single outlet installed by Joseph Webb in 1991 to run a trouble light. Marcus spent 3 weeks learning to run a bead on scrap steel. His first welds were cold and ugly, the beads sitting on top of the metal like gray caterpillars, not fused, just resting. He burned through. He undercut. He made every mistake the internet had promised he would make, in exactly the order the internet had predicted. He kept the failed pieces in a section of the shed he started thinking of as the archive. Things that taught him something didn't get thrown out. That was a rule he made without quite noticing he was making it. His first successful project was a garden gate for the house. Mild steel, square tubing for the frame, flat bar for the diagonal. A simple latch from the hardware store. He hung it himself. It weighed 11 kilograms. When he swung it and it moved on its hinges without binding, he stood there and let out a breath he'd been holding for 6 months. Diane came out and looked at it. She ran her hand along the top rail. "You made this?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "It's heavy. It's steel." She looked at him for a long time, the way she did when she was deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking. She went back inside. The gate stayed. When the neighbors asked, she said her son made it, in a voice that was carefully level but wasn't quite flat. To the town, Marcus was the kid with the scrap pile. Not mean about it. Sudbury was not a mean town, but consistent. His high school shop teacher, Mr. Belanger, told him in grade 11 that he had good hands and should consider a trades apprenticeship. That was probably the most encouraging thing an adult outside his family said to him during those years. Everyone else mostly talked around the pile, the way people talk around something they don't have a category for. Diane worried the way she always worried, with her hands and in the middle of the night. The pile was big. It was not making money. It was rusting in places and listing in others, and 3 times that she knew of the neighbors had called the city's property standards line. Each time an inspector came out, and each time Marcus explained the dimensions, the sorting system, the tarp covering that he relayed after every snowfall, and each time the inspector left without issuing a notice because, technically, the steel was stored within the property boundary and covered. The third inspector, a woman named Karen Thibault, looked at the sorting system for a long time before she left and said, "You've got a system here." It wasn't a compliment exactly. But it wasn't nothing. What the town couldn't see from the road was what Marcus had built behind the pile. By the time he was 17, the shed had changed. He had extended it himself, cinder block on 2 sides, corrugated steel roof, floor swept daily. Inside, the Lincoln 135 and a newer MIG unit he'd bought in pieces and assembled from a U-tube teardown, an angle grinder, a drill press he'd restored from a seized unit he found on Kijiji for $40, a cutoff saw, and a bench, the size of a small dog bolted to a workbench he'd fabricated himself from the first steel he'd ever collected. The angle iron from Terence Okafor's overflow bin in the summer he was 9. He told almost no one what he was making in there. Not because he was secretive, because he hadn't finished yet, and he had learned early that unfinished things couldn't defend themselves. At 18, he made his first sale. A neighbor 2 streets over wanted a railing for her front steps, something that would hold weight and wouldn't need painting every 2 years. Marcus quoted her $240, which she accepted. He delivered it on a Saturday, installed it in 40 minutes with a hammer drill borrowed from his shop teacher, and drove home with $240 in cash, which he held for a moment in both hands in the driveway before he went inside. He didn't spend it. He drove to an equipment auction in Espanola the following Saturday and came home with a tube bender and a plasma cutter, both needing work, both priced like junk. He worked on them for 3 months. When the plasma cutter finally ran clean, cutting through a 1/4-inch plate like a finger through water, he stood in the shed in his good gloves, with the face shield pushed up on his forehead and said nothing out loud but was not quiet inside. The pattern established itself. Build something, sell it. Take the money to an auction. Bring home something broken and bring it back to life. Every machine that came into the shed left cleaner and more capable than when it arrived. The pile outside kept growing as Terrence's successor at Norwood, a younger man named Gavin who had gotten the job 3 years earlier and inherited the arrangement without knowing its history, continued staging the overflow near the fence on weeks when the depot couldn't take it. The pile. Outside, from the road, it still looked like a junkyard. Marcus knew it didn't look like anything good. He had stopped being embarrassed about it by the time he was 16, but he hadn't stopped being aware of it. He kept the raw, unsorted material at the front, where the sight line from the road caught it. Behind it, hidden by the face of the pile, was something else. A sorted inventory, rod and tube and plate and angle, stickered on timber risers to keep it off the ground. Sorted by alloy, where he could identify it, by thickness and profile everywhere else, with dimensions marked in chalk on every piece and dates written with a paint pen on the bottom of each stack. Not a pile, an inventory. In the spring of 2023, Norwood Fabrication was acquired by a national infrastructure company called Meridian Structural Group. The new ownership sent a regional efficiency consultant named Karen Laughlin to audit operations. She was 38, had a project management certification from Ryerson, and wore the kind of shoes that made noise on concrete floors. She walked through the plant for 2 days with a clipboard and a laptop, and found, on the afternoon of the second day, a forklift operator staging a bin of steel offcuts along the western fence instead of the main collection area. She stopped walking. She asked where the bin was going. The forklift operator, who was not Gavin and did not know the history, said he'd been told to put it near the fence on Thursdays when the hauler wasn't coming. That was just how it was done. Karen Laughlin looked at the fence. She looked at the property on the other side. She pulled the lease records and the property assessments on her laptop standing in the cold of the back lot. She looked at the satellite image, which showed, from above, a long dark smear running the length of the western boundary of the Webb property, and she wrote 2 words in her notes: unauthorized disposal. The letter arrived at the Webb house 10 days later. It was signed by a lawyer in Ottawa, whose firm represented Meridian's real estate and environmental compliance division. The language was measured and final. Norwood Fabrication, operating under Meridian Structural Group, had become aware of an informal material staging practice on the adjacent property. Meridian had no record of any agreement authorizing disposal on private land. Effective 30 days from the date of the letter, all staging activity would cease. If the material already present on the property constituted a violation of municipal property standards, the property owner would be solely responsible for remediation. Diane read the letter at the kitchen table while Marcus stood by the window. "Marcus, I know. They're saying it's our problem to clean up. I know what they're saying." She folded the letter carefully, the way she folded things she needed to think about more before she responded. "How much steel is out there?" Marcus had run the numbers the night before, the way he always ran numbers, in the back of a notebook with a mechanical pencil. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "And you're not going to call the lawyer and explain that you've been taking it voluntarily and no one was forcing anything on anyone?" "No." She looked at him. "Because that's not the whole story," he said. He went out to the shed. He was in there until 1 in the morning. When he came back in, he washed his hands at the kitchen sink for a long time and went to bed without saying anything else. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus did something that the neighborhood watched with open confusion. He didn't rent a bin. He didn't call a hauler. He took the entire front face of the pile and moved it, not off the property, into the shed, into the smaller lean-to he'd built 2 summers ago along the south wall, and into a section of organized storage along the rear fence that he had been quietly expanding for a year. He worked from 6 in the morning until dark. When he was done, the strip of land along the western fence was bare. The ground showed the impressions where timber risers had sat for years, shallow rectangles pressed into the earth like outlines. From her office at the back of the plant, Karen Laughlin watched the ground appear through the window. On the last afternoon, she stood with a coffee and felt the satisfaction of someone who had identified a problem and watched it solve itself. She updated her notes. Western fence staging area cleared. No further action required. She did not know what had moved into the building at the back of the property. She did not go to look. Marcus put on the cleanest clothes he owned that didn't involve a hoodie. He drove to the Meridian Regional Office on LaSalle Boulevard on a Tuesday morning and asked the receptionist to let him know when Karen Laughlin was available. He said he was prepared to wait. He waited 45 minutes. Then Karen came through the door and stopped. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a complaint. A middle-aged man with an argument about property rights. Not a 23-year-old in a clean work jacket holding a manila envelope. He set the envelope on the reception desk without opening it. "My name is Marcus Webb," he said. "My family owns the property at the west boundary of your LaSalle plant. I'd like you to come see it before you decide what that letter means." Karen picked up the envelope. She opened it. She looked at the first page for a long time without speaking. "This is an invoice," she said. "Yes, for $47,000. That's the low estimate. I can show you the high one if you'd prefer." She looked up. For what exactly? For 14 years of material that your company's own disposal records show was written off as unrecoverable waste. I processed it. I inventoried it. I can account for every piece by date, species, dimension, and current market value. The math is in the envelope. Karen set the envelope down. We had no agreement with your family regarding disposal. I know, Marcus said. That's my point. Your company used my family's land as an informal waste buffer for 14 years without a formal agreement, which means without liability coverage, without environmental assessment, and without compensation. The invoice represents a fraction of what that arrangement saved your previous ownership in hauling costs. He said it the way he said most things. Not loud, not fast, just placed down in front of her like a piece of steel on a workbench. Here it is. Now look at it. Karen Lachlan had been in corporate real estate compliance for 11 years. She had a good instinct for the shape of a problem. She looked at the young man across the reception desk and understood that this was not a shakedown. This was a person who had done the math over a very long period of time and was now presenting the result. I'd like to see the property, she said. They drove back in separate cars. Marcus went first. They passed the house, the bare strip of earth along the western fence, and Marcus stopped at the door of the large shed at the back of the lot. The siding was corrugated steel. He had cut and hung every panel himself. Above the door, on a piece of structural angle iron, he had cut 4 words with the plasma cutter in a plain block font, the edges clean and even a tool used. He didn't explain it. He unlocked the side door and stepped back. Karen Lachlan walked in. The shed was not a shed. The floor was swept concrete, swept daily, and the morning light came down from 2 skylights. Marcus had cut and framed himself the summer he was 20, illuminating a room that smelled of metal and oil and the specific warmth of machines that have been used and maintained. Along the left wall, in sorted stacks on timber risers, was the inventory. Flat bar, angle iron, plate steel, square tube, round tube, sorted by dimension, chalk-marked, date-stamped at the bottom of each stack. 14 years of dates. Along the right wall were the machines. The Lincoln 135 where it had always been. The MIG unit, the tube bender, the plasma cutter, the drill press, the cut-off saw, the angle grinder on its dedicated station, everything hung or stored or mounted, everything clean. In the corner, a small workbench with a notebook open to the current page. Columns, date, material, dimensions, board footage equivalent, price per unit, running value. Karen walked to the notebook. She opened to the first page. The entries went back to 2011. She turned pages slowly. She was a person who understood documentation. She understood what she was looking at. 14 years of meticulous, handwritten inventory that would hold up in any commercial dispute she had ever been part of. She looked up. You built the machines too? Restored them. Most of them were non-functional when I bought them. She looked at the plasma cutter, at the tube bender, at the MIG unit with its neat cable wrap. How old were you when you started doing this? 9 when I started collecting. 14 when I started welding. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked from the inventory to the machines to the notebook to the young man in the work jacket standing with his hands loose at his sides. And she said in a voice that had changed register slightly from the voice she'd used in the reception area, "You built all of this from material my company threw away." It wasn't quite a question. Started with a piece of angle iron Terence Okafor set by the fence in 2011, Marcus said. I still have it. It's in the rack on the left. Bottom shelf. Karen Lachlan looked at the rack. She found a piece of angle iron on the bottom shelf, older than the rest, the chalk marking faded. She did not touch it. She stood there for a long time. Outside, through the high shed window, the Norwood plant's roof was visible. The 2 properties, separated by 4 feet of chain link. The legal work that followed moved faster than Karen expected and slower than Marcus had hoped. There were meetings. There were calls with the Ottawa lawyers. There was a period of 3 weeks where nothing happened officially, and Marcus kept working in the shed because that was the only useful thing to do while lawyers talked. In the end, it was simple. No version of National Infrastructure Company disputes inventory claims of 23-year-old black craftsman in Sudbury played well in any newspaper in Ontario. Meridian's legal team was realistic. They settled. Marcus received $22,000 in cash and a 5-year materials supply agreement. Meridian's Norwood plant would sell all steel offcuts to a newly registered business at 15 cents per kilogram, with priority access before any third-party recycler. The agreement was signed by Karen Lachlan and Marcus Webb. Karen's internal memo framed it as converting an environmental compliance liability into a preferred vendor relationship. She was commended in her performance review for creative problem resolution. She never fully understood which direction the agreement ran in his favor. Marcus took the $22,000 and did not bank it. He took a photograph. He took a photograph of the bottom shelf of the inventory rack, the original piece of angle iron with its faded chalk marking, leaning against the cinder block wall in the morning light. He posted it on Instagram with a caption that took him 20 minutes to write and was 43 words long. It said, "This piece of steel came from the plant next door when I was 9 years old. A forklift driver gave it to me because nobody wanted it. 14 years later, I have 40 tons of it sorted, inventoried, and ready to be turned into something." By the end of that week, the post had been shared 31,000 times. By the end of the month, a freelance journalist from CBC Sudbury had driven to the house on the long piece and stood in the shed with her recorder running, while Marcus walked her along the inventory rack and explained, stack by stack, what 14 years of other people's waste disposal decisions could become when one person decided to pay attention. The story ran online and then in the regional print edition and then got picked up by the national feed. The headline was calm and factual and said almost everything. Sudbury man built a steel fabrication shop from a neighboring plant's discarded offcuts. Now he's got a contract. The orders came in faster than one man could fill. Marcus did what 14 years of his grandfather's note had been preparing him for. He turned the work into a system. He took out a small business loan against the property, the 400-meter strip that Joseph Webb had bought in 1987 for $400 from a man who needed to settle a debt before winter. He poured a new floor in the extended section of the shed. He hired Terrence Okafor's nephew first, a 20-year-old named Deshaun, who had grown up hearing about the kid next door and showed up with a handshake and a willingness to learn. He hired 2 of the men from his high school shop class who had needed work since the mill closures 2 years earlier and were honest enough to say so directly. He reached out to 3 other fabrication plants in northern Ontario and made the same case he had made to Karen Lachlan. Their offcuts were sitting in a disposal contract that cost them money and generated nothing. Webb Fabrication would take everything, pay per kilogram, and process what the recycler was melting down into components worth 15 times the scrap rate. 2 of the 3 plants signed within a month. By the time Marcus was 24, Webb Fabrication employed 19 people. It produced architectural railings, structural brackets, custom gates, and industrial components for contractors across northern Ontario and into northern Quebec. It ran out of a building on a strip of land in Sudbury that everyone in the neighborhood had spent a decade calling an eyesore, and it was profitable. Diane quit the day shift the autumn Marcus turned 24. He brought her out to the shed on a Saturday morning before the crew arrived. She had been in the shed before. She had seen the machines, but he had never walked her through it the way he walked her through it that morning, inventory to machine to notebook, the way he would walk a new hire. He showed her the bottom shelf. He showed her the chalk marking on the piece of angle iron, faded now, almost gone. She put her hand on it. She held it there. She didn't say anything for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was the voice of someone who had carried a worry for a very long time and had just set it down somewhere it would not roll away. "Your grandfather would have had something to say about this," she said. "He did," Marcus said. "I read it every day." He showed her the note. She read it. "A tool used is worth 10 tools stored." She held the card for a moment, her thumb on the edge where the paper had worn soft, and then she handed it back without speaking. She put her arm around him, and they stood there in the light from the skylights, in a building that smelled of steel and oil and daily work, while the city beyond the fence went about its Saturday. Today, Webb Fabrication still operates on the property Joseph Webb bought in 1987. The original shed, the one Marcus extended himself at 17 with cinder block walls and a corrugated roof, is where new hires start. Their first morning, before they touch a machine, Marcus walks them to the bottom shelf of the inventory rack and tells them the story of a piece of angle iron that a forklift driver left by a chain-link fence because nobody wanted it. The note from the red toolbox is framed above the shop door. The frame is mild steel, cut and welded by hand. The words inside are typed on a card that Marcus retyped himself from his grandfather's original, which had gone soft at the folds from being read. Dale Coburn's invoice is on the wall in the small office Marcus built for himself off the main floor. He framed it too, behind glass, matte, clean. A client noticed it once and asked what the story was. Marcus looked up from the piece he was fitting. "I sent that to the man who called my family's land a dumping ground," he said. He laughed when he read it. He went back to work. The plasma cutter ran clean through a 1/4-inch plate, leaving an edge so straight it looked like something measured twice and cut once, which it was, because that was how the work got done, and always had been. Some companies write a number into a disposal contract because their spreadsheets have no column for what patients can do to a pile of steel over 14 years. The story of Marcus Webb is not a story about a lawsuit or a settlement or a social media post that changed an algorithm's mind. Those things happened. They're not the story. The story is a 9-year-old standing at a chain-link fence watching a forklift driver make a decision about what was worth keeping. The story is every Thursday for 14 years. The story is the faded chalk mark on the bottom shelf of a rack in a building on a strip of land in Sudbury that nobody could talk a Webb into selling. If you've ever had something of your own that people couldn't figure out, something they called a waste of time or an eyesore or a strange stubborn habit that made no sense from the outside, you already know something about how that inventory gets built. One piece at a time, in the quiet, long before anyone comes to see it.